If you think you know what happens behind those walls, you are not even close. Subscribe to Ironbars Media, smash that like button, and turn on notifications right now, because once this story pulls you in, there is no walking away from it. Let us go. The bridge is only 400 feet long. That is all that separates the world you know from the world you do not. 400 feet of narrow concrete stretching across the East River, connecting Queens to an island that does not appear on any tourist map, does not have a subway stop, and does not welcome visitors without a reason. Most people who cross that bridge do so in the back of a Department of Correction bus, hands zip-tied, wearing the clothes they were arrested in, staring at the floor because looking out the window at the water moving beneath them makes the whole thing feel too real, too fast. Marcus Tate crossed that bridge on a Tuesday morning in November, 23 years old, arrested 4 days earlier on an assault charge he swore he did not commit. He had never been inside a jail before. He had never been fingerprinted, never been strip-searched, never stood in a line of strangers in a fluorescent-lit room and been handed a bedroll and a pair of rubber sandals and told to move. He was not a criminal. He was a warehouse worker from the South Bronx who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, standing outside a bodega when a fight broke out 2 feet away from him, and a witness who did not look closely enough had pointed at the nearest young black man and told a responding officer that is him. His bail was set at $15,000. His mother, Patricia Tate, a 58-year-old home health aide, working double shifts to keep a 2-bedroom apartment in Mott Haven, had $400 in her checking account. Marcus Tate was going to Rikers Island. The intake process took 11 hours. 11 hours of waiting and holding pens that smelled like sweat and fear and industrial cleaning fluid that never quite covered either. 11 hours of being processed, photographed, medically screened, classified, and assigned to a housing unit by a system that moved with the grinding indifference of a machine that had processed so many human beings for so long that it had stopped registering them as such. By the time Marcus was walked to his assigned unit in the Eric M. Taylor Center, it was past midnight, and the corridor he walked through was lit by the kind of pale institutional light that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly underwater. He was assigned a cell. His cellmate was a man named Calvin Briggs, 44 years old, soft-spoken, with careful eyes and the particular stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that stillness was a survival skill. Calvin had been at Rikers for 11 months waiting on a weapons charge. He had a lawyer he had spoken to twice. He had a court date that had been postponed 4 times. He had a daughter named Imani who was 7 years old and who drew pictures of him that her grandmother mailed to the facility in envelopes decorated with crayon flowers. Calvin looked at Marcus for a long moment when the cell door closed behind him, taking in the wide eyes, the tight jaw, the way the younger man's hands would not stop moving at his sides. He said, quietly and without drama, "First night is the hardest. After that it just becomes life." Marcus did not know it yet, but Calvin Briggs would become the most important person he met inside those walls. He also did not know that Calvin was carrying something that made him one of the most dangerous people to be close to on the entire island. On the outside, 3 people were already moving. The first was Patricia Tate, who had not slept since her son's arrest, and who was sitting at a kitchen table at 1 in the morning with a legal aid number on a piece of paper in front of her, working up the courage to call it for the third time, because the first 2 times she had been put on hold and eventually disconnected, and she was running out of both time and faith in a system that had never given her much reason for either. The second was a journalist named Sophia Reyes, 36 years old, a staff writer for a mid-size investigative outlet based in Manhattan, who had been building a story about conditions inside Rikers Island for 7 months. She had sources inside the facility, carefully protected, carefully managed. She had documents, internal grievance reports, medical incident logs that painted a picture of a place operating so far outside any reasonable standard of institutional care that she had started sleeping with her notes locked in a fireproof box under her bed, because the story she was building was the kind that made powerful people nervous. The third was a man named Lieutenant Jerome Hicks, 17 years with the Department of Correction, currently assigned to the Eric M. Taylor Center, a man who had started his career believing in the mission of the institution and had spent the better part of a decade watching that belief erode piece by piece until what was left was something harder and more complicated and considerably more dangerous. Hicks knew things about Rikers Island that no official report had ever captured. He also knew that knowing things inside that facility was its own kind of liability. The first week passed for Marcus. Tate, in a blur of orientation sessions, meal lines, rec periods that lasted 45 minutes in a concrete yard, surrounded by razor wire, and the slow, disorienting process of learning the unwritten rules of a world that operated entirely on its own logic. He learned which corrections officers could be spoken to and which ones could not. He learned which areas of the unit to avoid after dark. He learned that the noise never fully stopped, that even at 3 in the morning the facility hummed and clanged and breathed with a kind of restless, caged energy that made real sleep nearly impossible. Calvin watched him learn, offered quiet guidance when it was needed, said nothing when silence was the better option. On the 8th day, something happened that changed the dynamic of everything. A fight broke out in the meal hall. Fast, brutal, over in less than 90 seconds, but loud enough and violent enough that the entire unit was locked down for 6 hours afterward. Marcus was not involved. He was 3 tables away when it started and had the instinct to drop to the floor and stay there, which Calvin had told him in the first week was always the right instinct when the room changed temperature. But when the lockdown ended and the unit returned to something approaching normal, Calvin came back to the cell with a look on his face that Marcus had not seen before. Not fear exactly. Something more controlled than fear. Something that suggested Calvin had seen something during the lockdown that he was now very carefully deciding what to do with. He sat on his bunk. He looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he reached under his mattress and pulled out a small notebook, the kind with a cardboard cover and ruled pages, and he held it for a moment without opening it. He said, "I need you to understand something. What I am about to show you is either going to keep us both safe or get us both killed. And I need to know right now which one it is before I open this." Marcus looked at the notebook. He looked at Calvin. He said, "Open it." And when Calvin Briggs turned to the first page of that notebook and Marcus Tate saw what was written inside, the cold that moved through him had nothing to do with the November air coming through the gap in the window above the cell door. It had everything to do with the name written at the top of the first page, a name Marcus recognized, a name that had no business being inside a notebook in a cell on Rikers Island. And yet there it was. The name at the top of the first page was Lieutenant Jerome Hicks. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at Calvin, then back down at the page, because sometimes the brain needs a second pass to confirm that what the eyes are seeing is real and not a product of sleep, deprivation, and institutional stress and 8 days of living inside a place that made everything feel slightly disconnected from reality. But it was real. And beneath Hicks's name, written in Calvin's small, careful handwriting, was a list. Not a long one. 12 entries, each one dated, each one describing a specific event, a specific exchange, a specific moment that Calvin had witnessed or been told about by someone he trusted enough to record. The entries were written in a kind of compressed, factual language that suggested Calvin understood the difference between what could be proven and what could only be suspected, and had been disciplined enough to record only the former. Marcus read the first 3 entries without speaking. The first described a transaction. A corrections officer unnamed, but described in enough physical detail to be identifiable, passing a package to an inmate on the north corridor during a shift change using the brief window of camera blind spot that occurred every evening at 6:47 when the east corridor camera completed its rotation cycle, and the backup feed lagged by approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. 4 seconds had apparently been enough for months. The second entry described a conversation Calvin had overheard through the ventilation gap above his cell door during a night shift between 2 officers whose voices he had learned to identify over 11 months of proximity. The conversation was about a detainee named Rodrigo Vilas, 26 years old, who had filed a formal grievance against a corrections officer 3 weeks earlier, and who had, within 48 hours of filing that grievance, been moved to a housing unit where he had no allies, no protection, and a cellmate with a documented history of violent incidents. Rodrigo Vilas had been hospitalized 10 days after the transfer. The official incident report listed the cause as a fall. The third entry was the one that made Marcus set the notebook down on his knee and breathe carefully through his nose for a moment before continuing. It described Lieutenant Jerome Hicks directly, not as a passive observer of what was happening in his unit, as a participant, as someone who had, according to a source Calvin identified only as a person with direct knowledge and no reason to lie, been receiving payments routed through an outside account in exchange for managing which detainees were assigned to which housing units, which grievances were processed, and which ones disappeared into administrative silence, and which correction officers were assigned to which shifts in ways that created the specific windows of opportunity that made everything else possible. Hicks was not the top of it, but he was a load-bearing wall. Calvin closed the notebook and looked at Marcus with those careful, measured eyes and said, "I have been building this for 4 months. I was going to give it to my lawyer, but my lawyer stopped returning my calls 6 weeks ago, and I do not know if that is because he is incompetent or because someone got to him first." Marcus said, "Why are you showing me this?" Calvin said, "Because during that lockdown today, I saw Hicks look at me in a way he has never looked at me before, and I have been here long enough to know what that look means." Marcus understood. It meant Calvin was running out of time. On the outside, Sophia Reyes had spent the morning in a coffee shop in Long Island City, sitting across from a source she was meeting for the 3rd time, a former Department of Correction employee who had left the agency 18 months earlier under circumstances that the official record described as a voluntary resignation, and that the source described, in a voice kept deliberately low, as anything but voluntary. The source's name was never recorded in Sophia's notes. She referred to him only as a single initial, a habit she had developed early in her career working corruption cases where the distance between a named source and a dead source could be measured in hours. What he told her that morning added a dimension to her story that she had not anticipated. He told her that the network she had been documenting, the pattern of housing manipulations and grievance suppressions and corrupt shift assignments, was not a collection of individual officers acting independently for personal gain. It was coordinated. It had a structure, and that structure extended beyond the facility itself into the contractual relationships between the Department of Correction and several private vendors whose contracts had been awarded through a procurement process that had on at least 3 occasions in the past 4 years bypassed standard competitive bidding requirements. The money was not just coming from inside the facility. It was coming from outside it, flowing in through legitimate-looking channels, washing through vendor relationships and consulting fees and administrative contracts, and finding its way to the people inside who kept the machine running smoothly enough that nobody looked too closely at the gears. Sophia drove back to her office and sat at her desk for a long time without opening her laptop. She was close. She could feel the shape of the full story now the way you can feel the shape of a room in the dark, not seeing it exactly but understanding its dimensions, knowing where the walls are. But close was not the same as ready, and ready was not the same as safe. And she had a source inside Rikers Island who had been feeding her information for 3 months and who had gone silent 11 days ago without explanation. She picked up her phone and called the number she had for him. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. She did not leave a message. Instead, she opened her laptop and pulled up the internal grievance logs she had obtained through a Freedom of Information request 4 months earlier. She had read them before, but she read them again, now with the new information from her source layered over them. And what had previously looked like a pattern of administrative negligence began to look like something considerably more deliberate. She found Rodrigo Velez in the logs. She found his grievance, filed and time-stamped. She found the notation indicating it had been received and assigned for review. And then she found something she had missed the first time, a secondary notation, added 3 days after the initial filing, in a different administrative hand, that marked the grievance as resolved without any record of an investigation, without any record of a response to Velez, without any record of any action taken whatsoever. Resolved. Just like that. She searched the hospitalization records she had obtained separately through a source in the medical unit. She found Velez, admitted 11 days after his housing transfer, discharged after 4 days, cause of injury listed as accidental. She sat back in her chair. Then she picked up her phone again and called a number she had been holding in reserve for 2 weeks. A number that belonged to a federal investigator she had met at a conference the previous year, a woman with a reputation for moving carefully and hitting hard, who had given Sophia her card with the specific instruction to call if she ever had something that was bigger than a newspaper story. Sophia Reyes had something that was bigger than a newspaper story. Back inside Rikers, Marcus Tate spent the rest of that day moving through the unit with a particular kind of forced casualness of someone carrying a secret that feels physically heavy. He ate his evening meal without tasting it. He sat through the remaining rec period watching the yard without seeing it. And when the unit was locked down for the night and he was back in the cell with Calvin, he lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about the notebook under Calvin's mattress and what it meant for both of them that it existed. He thought about his mother sitting at a kitchen table in Mott Haven. He thought about the assault charge he had not committed and the bail he could not make and the court date that was still 6 weeks away. And then he thought about something Calvin had said to him on the very first night, quiet and without drama, delivered with the certainty of a man who had learned it the hard way. First night is the hardest. After that it just becomes life. Marcus was beginning to understand that Calvin had not been talking about the noise or the smell or the food, or the loss of privacy or any of the physical indignities that the facility inflicted on the people inside it, daily and without apology. He had been talking about the moment when you stopped being shocked by what you were seeing, the moment when the corruption and the violence and the deliberate, institutional cruelty stopped feeling like an exception and started feeling like the rule. That was the moment Rikers Island truly had you. And at 11:43 that night, when the unit had settled into its restless approximation of quiet and Calvin, say breathing, had slowed into sleep, Marcus heard something outside the cell door that made him go completely still. Footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, stopping directly outside their cell. A pause that lasted 4 seconds. Then the sound of a key being inserted into the lock. Not for a routine check. Someone was opening the door. And when the cell door swung open and Marcus saw who was standing in the frame, backlit by the pale corridor light, he understood with absolute clarity that Calvin had been right. They had run out of time. Lieutenant Jerome Hicks was not a large man. That was the first thing Marcus noticed, because in the stories people tell about dangerous men there is usually a physical component, a size, a presence, something the body registers before the mind catches up. But Hicks was medium height, medium build, with the kind of unremarkable face that disappeared in a crowd and a stillness about him that was not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a man who had learned to keep everything he was thinking behind a surface that revealed nothing. He stood in the doorway of the cell for a moment without speaking. Behind Marcus, Calvin had stopped breathing with the deliberate control of someone pretending to be asleep, who was very much awake, and very much aware that the quality of the next 60 seconds would determine a great deal about what came after them. Hicks looked at Marcus. Then he looked at the bunk where Calvin lay facing the wall. Then he looked back at Marcus with an expression that was not threatening exactly, but contained the specific promise of threat the way a closed fist contains the promise of impact. He said, quietly enough that it would not carry past the cell door, "You are the new one." It was not a question. Marcus said nothing. Hicks nodded slowly, as though the silence itself was an answer he had been expecting. He looked around the cell with the practiced eye of someone conducting an assessment, taking in the shelf above, Calvin's bunk, the space beneath both mattresses, the small pile of personal items. Marcus had accumulated in 8 days, and then his eyes settled on the mattress above the floor where Calvin slept, and stayed there for just a fraction of a second longer than anywhere else. He knew about the notebook, or he suspected, which in a place like Rikers Island amounted to the same thing. He said, "Get some sleep. Court dates have a way of moving fast when people cooperate with the process." Then he pulled the cell door closed, and his footsteps moved back down the corridor with the same unhurried deliberateness with which they had arrived, and the sound of them faded into the ambient noise of the facility until there was nothing left but the hum of the ventilation system and the distant clang of a door closing somewhere deep in the building. Calvin sat up the moment the footsteps were gone. He did not look frightened. He looked like a man who had just had a suspicion confirmed and was now moving through the calculation of what confirmation meant for his next move. He reached under the mattress and pulled out the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment, and then he did something Marcus did not expect. He tore out the first 6 pages, carefully, cleanly, along the binding, folding them into a tight rectangle, no larger than a playing card. He held the rectangle out to Marcus and said, "You are going to get these out. Not me. They are not going to search you the way they will search me, and we both know it, because you've been here 8 days, and I have been here 11 months, and Hicks does not see you yet the way he sees me." Marcus looked at the folded pages. He said, "How do I get them out?" Calvin said, "Your mother visits on Saturday." On the outside, Sophia Reyes had not slept in 31 hours. She was sitting in the office of federal investigator Dana Mercer, a compact, precise woman in her late 40s, who listened without interrupting, which Sophia had learned over years of dealing with law enforcement was rarer than it should have been, and more valuable than almost anything else in a room where important things were being said. Sophia had laid everything out: the grievance logs, the hospitalization records, the vendor contracts, the procurement irregularities, the pattern of housing manipulations, the source who had gone silent. All of it organized in a sequence that told the story not as a collection of individual failures, but as a designed system with intentional architecture and deliberate maintenance. Mercer listened to all of it. Then she opened a drawer in her desk and placed a file folder on the surface between them and slid it across without comment. Sophia opened it. Inside was a photograph, surveillance quality, taken from a distance, slightly grainy but clear enough. It showed Lieutenant Jerome Hicks standing outside a restaurant in Astoria, Queens, across a table from a man. Sophia did not immediately recognize both of them leaning slightly forward in the posture of people discussing something they do not want overheard. Sophia looked up. Mercer said, "We have been watching Hicks for 5 months. What we did not have was the internal documentation to connect him to the financial architecture. What you're describing fills that gap," Sophia said. "Who is the man across the table?" Mercer looked at her for a moment before answering. The man across the table was a senior procurement officer within the Department of Corrections Administrative Division, a man whose signature appeared on 3 of the vendor contracts Sophia had flagged for bypassing competitive bidding, a man who had, over the previous 4 years, approved over $11 million in contracts to companies whose beneficial ownership traced through a sequence of shell entities incorporated in Delaware and Nevada to a single holding company registered in the name of a retired corrections official who had left the department with a commendation and a pension and apparently no intention of leaving the business. The network was not just inside Rikers. It had never been just inside Rikers. Rikers was the engine. The money was everywhere else. Patricia Tate arrived for her Saturday visit, carrying a container of her son as favorite food that the facility as visit room regulations did not permit her to bring inside, which she had known before she left home, but had brought anyway because the act of Preparing it and carrying it had given her something to do with her hands during the 4 days between when she decided to come and when she was finally sitting across a scratched table from her son in a room full of other people as grief and love and desperate normalcy. Marcus hugged her for longer than the regulations technically permitted. A corrections officer at the perimeter of the room shifted his weight, but did not intervene. When they sat down, Marcus reached across the table and took both his mother's hands in his, and held them and talked about nothing for 4 minutes about the food at the facility, and whether he could see through the narrow window in his unit and a television program the men in his block argued about every evening with an intensity that under other circumstances would have been funny. He talked about nothing with the focused attention of a man buying time, while every nerve in his body was calibrated to the position of every corrections officer in the room. Then he leaned forward slightly and said very quietly, with his eyes on his mother's face and his hands still covering hers, "I need you to take something home for me. It is in my left palm. You are going to put your hand over mine when I pass it to you, and you are going to put it in your pocket, and you are going to take it to the address I am going to give you right now, and you are going to give it to whoever answers the door, and you are going to tell them Calvin sent you." Patricia Tate had raised a son alone in the South Bronx for 23 years. She did not flinch. She did not look down at his hands. She looked directly at her son's face and said, "Tell me the address." The folded pages reached Sophia Reyes by Saturday evening. She unfolded them on her kitchen table under a bright light and read Calvin Briggs's careful, compressed handwriting with the focused attention of someone who understood that what they were holding had cost the person who wrote it an enormous amount and needed to be treated accordingly. The entries confirmed everything her source had told her. They added names, dates, specific amounts, specific transactions described with a kind of granular detail that only comes from direct observation, from someone who had been inside the machine long enough to understand how its parts moved, and had been disciplined enough and frightened enough and angry enough to write it all down. She called Dana Mercer at 9 that evening. Mercer had the notebook pages in federal hands by Sunday morning. The arrests came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks later, moving simultaneously across 4 locations to prevent any single arrest from triggering a warning to the others. Lieutenant Jerome Hicks was taken into custody at the facility during a shift change, which the Department of Correction as Public Affairs Office described in a statement as a routine personnel matter before the federal indictment made that description impossible to maintain. The procurement officer was arrested at his home in Staten Island. 2 corrections officers named in Calvin's notes were picked up within the hour. The retired official whose holding company sat at the center of the financial architecture was found at a golf course in Florida, and he was the only one of the 4 who laughed when the agents approached him, a short, dry sound entirely without humor, the laugh of a man who had known this was coming and had simply decided there was nothing to be done about it when it arrived. Marcus Tate's assault charge was reviewed as part of the broader investigation into case manipulation within the facility's administrative processes. The review found irregularities in the original witness statement. The charge was dismissed on a Friday afternoon, and Marcus walked across that 400-foot bridge in the reverse direction, back toward Queens, back toward the world, on a November morning, exactly 6 weeks after he had crossed it going the other way, his mother was waiting at the end of the bridge. She did not say anything. She put both arms around him and held on with the particular fierceness of a woman who had spent 6 weeks being afraid and was now allowing herself, carefully and in stages, to stop. Calvin Briggs received a formal commendation from the Federal Investigation Team for his cooperation and documentation. His attorney, a new one secured through a legal advocacy organization that Sophia Reyes had contacted on his behalf, filed a motion citing the irregularities in his original case processing. His trial date, which had been postponed 4 times, was finally scheduled. He called his daughter Imani on the evening the trial date was confirmed. She told him she had drawn him a new picture. A house this time with a door and windows and a garden outside, and a figure standing in the doorway that she had labeled in 7-year-old handwriting with his name. He asked her to mail it to him. She said she would. Sophia Reyes published her investigation 8 weeks after the arrests. It ran across 4 days, each installment adding a new layer to the story of a system that had been designed to hold people accountable and had been quietly converted, piece by piece, into a machine that fed on the very people it was supposed to protect. The series was shared widely cited in 3 separate legislative hearings and nominated for an award that Sophia accepted with the particular ambivalence of someone who understood that the story being celebrated was not a victory but a documentation of ongoing failure. Rikers Island was still open. The bridge was still there. And on any given Tuesday morning somewhere in the city, someone was being processed, photographed, classified, and assigned innocent, until proven guilty in the eyes of a law that would take its time getting around to proving anything, while the island sat in the middle of that cold black river and waited with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. Because the island knew something that the people crossing that bridge were always learning for the first time. It had all the time in the world, and the world outside had already moved on. You just survived Rikers Island twice. If these stories have you locked in and coming back for more, then you already know what Ironbars Media is about. Subscribe right now, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and tell us which character hit you hardest. And share this with someone who needs to understand what really happens behind those walls. We are not done, not even close. The next story is already waiting. Ironbars Media. Real stories, real stakes. No bars held.